Alright guys, we are on Unit 8, the last lesson here on trigonometry. So trigonometry is going to be big on the calculator, and for the first time you're going to get to use some buttons that you've seen since you've had a graphing calculator and probably didn't know what to do with them. And that's the sine, cosine, and tangent buttons. And so we're going to learn how to use those. But in order to use trigonometry, you have to have a target angle, and in this case that's that one. And you need to know some things about how the sides relate to that angle. This side is the hypotenuse. It's important to always be able to remember that. The side that is across from the angle is the opposite side. The side that is part of the angle that's not the hypotenuse is the adjacent side. So we have an angle, and the angle that we're talking about will be made up of the adjacent and the hypotenuse. And then the other side is the side opposite. So the reason why we do this is because the first thing we have to decide is whether to use sine, cosine, or tangent. And that's built on the idea of what is sine, cosine, and tangent. So sine is where we take the opposite and divide it by the hypotenuse. Cosine is where we take the adjacent and divide it by the hypotenuse. And tangent is where we take the opposite and divide it by the adjacent. So let's take a look at our practice problem here and talk about how we find the sine, cosine, and tangent of angle C. Here's angle C. The first thing I'm going to want you to do is identify the hypotenuse, adjacent, and opposite. The hypotenuse is here. The adjacent is here. And the opposite is here. So here's how we write the formula to find the sine, cosine, and tangent of something. So to write the sine, looking at our patterns above, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So we're going to say that the sine of angle C is equal to 5 over 13. The cosine of angle C, well, that's adjacent over hypotenuse, is equal to 12 over 13. And the tangent of angle C is equal to 5 over 12. Now that's all fine and dandy. However, we can now use this information to find out what the measure of angle C is. So in your calculator you have the sine, cosine, and tangent button. And right now we don't know what the angle is. So we really can't hit the sine of whatever our angle is. It's not going to be helpful to us because we don't know what it is. Well, in our calculator, when we don't know the angle, we use the inverse. So if I hit the second sine of 5 over 13 and hit enter, oh, that's actually brought up a good point. This is not a whole number. So in order for us to do this, we need to make sure our calculator is in the correct mode. Our calculator should be in degrees. So once you hit the mode and change the calculator over and your calculator's in the degrees, now we're going to do it again. Second sine of 5 over 13. Now we've gotten a whole number. When we're doing angles, we round angles to the nearest whole number. And so given the fact that the ratio of the sine 5 of 13 gives us 22.61, 22.62, we're going to go with that angle C is 23 degrees. Now, we we can check this with cosine and tangent. So when I hit second cosine of 12 over 13, I should get the same answer because the relationship between the adjacent and the hypotenuse should give me the same answer. And it does. When I hit second tangent of 5 over 12, I should also get the same answer because of the relationship between the opposite and the hypotenuse. Or the opposite and adjacent, I'm sorry. So, and they do. And it's because angle C in this picture is 23 degrees. And so now we can do angle A. Because we know if this is 90 and this is 23 and a 180 in a triangle, then we just subtract 90, subtract 23, and we're good to go. And so angle A is 67 degrees. Essentially, trigonometry will get us any missing piece that we don't already know. You can use trigonometry in any right triangle because once you find one side or one piece, you can find the missing piece. But it's most helpful in finding odd angle measures because Pythagorean theorem will do a lot of the stuff that we need to do, like if we have two sides and not a third side, for example. Where trigonometry will also help is when we only have the measure of one side. So we're gonna take a look at that, and we're gonna talk through a bunch of these problems here, and then I've got extra practice for you when it's all said and done. So on the back, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to label all the triangles. So basically, I'm going to circle my angle, and I'm going to label the hypotenuse. I'm going to label the adjacent. So basically, I'm going to make sure I label the hypotenuse and the adjacent, and then I'm going to label the opposite. If the angle is x, that's fine. Circle the angle, label the hypotenuse, label the adjacent, label the opposite. So what I want you to do now is I want you to pause the video. I want you to finish labeling opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse for all 12, and then we'll check them. Okay, so hopefully you took the time to do that. And the key for me is I circled the angle, and I knew I had to have one hypotenuse and one adjacent, and then label the opposite. The ones where it gets difficult is where the adjacent is really big, and you want to accidentally like put this as the hypotenuse, or if you flip opposite and adjacent. Some students do that. Just remember the adjacent will be next to the angle. So again, I want to check these answers. Check 7 through 9. And go ahead and check 10 through 12. Should be good to go. Okay. So the next thing we have to do is and trigonometry to me comes in steps. First, you want to label your sides. Second, you want to decide what trig function are we doing. Are we doing sine, cosine, or tangent? And so that's what I'm going to walk you through right now, and then I want you to do it I'm going to do it for the first three, and then I want you to do it for the other ones, okay? So I have my angle, and then I notice I have x and 32. X is on the opposite, and 32 is on the adjacent. So I flip over to the other side here, and until you memorize this, unfortunately you're going to have to use the thing to flip back and forth, but tangent is opposite over adjacent. And so I know for number 1, I'm going to have the tangent. And so right now, that's all I'm writing on number 1. We're going to talk about how we write the proportion and all of that here in a minute. For number 2, I see the x, and O is 12, H is 16. A is nothing, so I can't use A. And that's what I wanted to discuss. Like, you can't use H because you don't have a variable or a number. I can't use A because I don't have a variable or a number. So I have O and H. Well, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So I'm going to go ahead and put sine here. And number 3, I can't use hypotenuse again, so it's O and A. That's tangent. And I want to give you one that's cosine just so you can see it. Here we go. Number 5, angle, don't use opposite, so that is cosine. And I'm going to just go here just because I went above on all the rest. So anyway, what I want you to do now is I want you to go through and identify, are we using sine, cosine, or tangent on 1 through 12. So go ahead and take a minute, pause the video, and write down whether we're using sine, cosine, or tangent. Okay, so hopefully you were able to do it. Number 4 was sine. You have opposite hypotenuse. Number 6 was tangent. You have opposite over adjacent. Number 7 was sine, opposite hypotenuse. 8 was cosine. 8 was tangent. 6 was tangent. 9 was cosine. 10 was tangent. 11 is sine, and 12 is cosine. So again, like I talked about, I have 4 steps. So the first step is label the sides, so I know what I'm doing. Second step is find the trig function, and I'm using sine, cosine, or tangent. The third step is set up proportion. So in order to set the proportion, I have to understand that it is written in either, and I'm just going to use this example, the sine of x, and x is my angle. So I'm going to rewrite this in here with angle. So the whatever of my angle is equal to, and so for example in sine, it's opposite over hypotenuse. So whatever the numbers are that were given. So cosine would be the cosine of the angle is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent is the tangent of the angle opposite over adjacent. So, for example, in number 1, the tangent of my angle, so the tangent of 28 degrees is equal to x over 32. In number 2, the sine of x is equal to, well, 12 over 16. Number 3, the tangent of x is equal to 5 over 12. So you can see, like, I'm using the pattern to determine where the 3 pieces of information go: x, 12, and 5. The angle always goes next to the sine, cosine, or tangent, and then the sides go in the fraction. So I want you to go ahead and finish 4 through 12. Pause the video right now, and then we'll check them when you're done. Alright guys, so hope ratios correctly. Number 4 was the sine of 40 equals 16 over x. Number 5, cosine of 64, 15 over x. 6, tangent of x equals 4 over 1. 7, the sine of x equals 13 over 27. 8, the tangent of x equals 27 over 8. 9, the cosine of 33 equals x over 19. The tangent of x is equal to 23 over 11. 11, the sine of x is equal to 9 over 29. And 12, the cosine of 41 is equal to x over 32. So there are 4 steps like we talked about. The first is to label sides. The second is to pick which trig function. The third is to set the proportion. And then the final step is you have to decide. Is it multiply, divide, or inverse? And here's where we have to decide. And it all depends on where the x is. If the x is beside the trig function, so if it's the sine of x is equal to a number over a number, you do what we call the inverse. If the x is on the top, so if we have the sine of a number is equal to x over a number, then we multiply. If the x is on the bottom of the fraction, so if we have sine of a number is equal to the number divided by x, then we divide. So again, like I said, it depends on where the x is. So if it's on the top of the fraction, you're going to multiply. If it's on the bottom, you're going to divide. And if it's beside the trig function, you're going to use the inverse. So let's do an example of each. Alright, so here's one where the x is on the top. So what we're going to do, if the x is on the top, we're going to do 32 times the tangent of 28, because algebra tells us to get the x by itself, we have to multiply by 32. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Again, we want to check and make sure that our calculator cuts on, first of all. And then once our calculator is on, we want to make sure it's in the right mode, just like we talked about before. It's in degrees. And so, like I said, we're going to do 32 times the tangent of 28. So 32 times the tangent of 28. Now, what we're finding here is a side length. And so, on side lengths, we're going to round to 2 decimal points. And so, in this case, x is equal to 17.01. So the answer to number 1 is x is equal to 17.01. Okay, let's look at one where the x is on the bottom. So we're going to go to number 4. Now, when the x is on the bottom, in order to get the x by itself, if there's a 16 on top, we have to divide by 16 to get the x by itself. And so, you know, that's one way we could do it, but that's not the way that we're going to do it. Essentially, what happens is, the first thing you would do is multiply by x on both sides. So you get an x over here and get rid of this, and then you divide by the sine of 40. So if we did 32 times the tangent of 28 in number 1, we're going to do 16 divided by the sine of 40 in number 4. And again, like I said, x on top, you take your number on the bottom and multiply it by the tangent. If the x is on the bottom, you take the number on the top and divide it by the trigonometry function with the decimal, or with the angle value. So 16 divided by the sine of 40. And we get, again, this is a side length, so we're going to round to 2 decimal places. We get x is equal to 24.89. Now I want to do one where we do the inverse, and that's the ones we did that were like on the front. So when the x is here, we're talking about an angle measure. So we're going to round that to the nearest degree, but that's when we have to use the inverse. And this is actually the easiest of them all, because if the x is there, there's already a fraction. So we hit second, and whatever our trig function is, and then 12 over 16. Again, because it's a degree, we're going to round to the nearest whole number. So 48.59 rounds to 49 degrees. Okay? Alright, so again, just to know that there are 3 different ways to do this. If the x is on top, you multiply it by your trig function with the with the angle value. If x is on the bottom, you take the other number and divide by the trig function with the angle value. And if the x is the angle, you do the inverse. So second, whatever your trig function is, and then you put the fraction in the parentheses and close it, and you get your measure. Don't forget, round to 2 decimal places for sides, round to the whole number for angles. So go ahead and complete these. And what I'm going to get you to do is I'm going to get you to check them with me to make sure that you've done them correctly, the rest of 3 through 12. And then when you're done with that, we'll move on to the review. I've got a lot of great review items for trigonometry, but again, it just goes down to the same thing. Follow the steps. Label your sides, adjacent, opposite, hypotenuse. Usually the adjacent and hypotenuse are best to do first, and then you label the opposite. Then pick which one it is. Is it sine, cosine, or tangent? If sine, it's going to be opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent, opposite over adjacent. Then set up your proportion. Put the whatever of your angle, and then make sure you make your fraction. And then finally, once you have that, decide, do I need to multiply, divide, or take the inverse? If the x is on top, you're going to multiply this number times this. If x is on the bottom, you're going to divide this number by this. And if x is the angle, you're going to take the inverse. Any questions, see me. Good luck, and do your best, take your time. And really what I'm going to be checking for is, do you have your fractions set up? I'll help you, or do you have your proportion set up? I'll help you with the calculator part if it comes to it, okay? All right, guys.